Welcome to Asiatique. I'm your host, Dr. Raymond. Last week, another border dispute happened between India and China. Now, what interests me is that there is a piece of news that said 200 Chinese PLA soldiers actually entered into Indian territories and they were sent back by Indian army battered and bruised. And there were even pictures of the Indian army together with a PLA soldier crying. Now, that actually interests me a lot because that's not just about a fight, that's not just about a dispute, it's actually more than that. And this week we're going to look at what's behind this piece of news. Well, I said I'm going to look into the border dispute between India and China, and I said there was even a picture showing the Indian army and as well as a crying PLA soldier. And that exactly is what interests me. Now, if you look at the picture, you would see one thing. You can tell right away. Number one, those Indian soldiers are not marching because they've won the battle, and that PLA soldier wasn't crying because he lost one. Now, why is it that today we actually have news reports with these kind of pictures? Now, don't you find it strange? I mean, what's the point of showing you pictures that has nothing to do with the actual news? Now, you might say, well, that's how they operate. That's how news agencies operate. Yes, that's right. But the problem is, why are we so accustomed to seeing these or reading from these pictures? Why are we even fighting about this? For example, what happened was right after this piece of news was released, the Chinese state media Global Times actually released a short footage on Twitter showing a bunch of, actually several Indian soldiers being captured and, captured alive. Well, the Indian side denied everything right away, of course. Now, the thing is, when everybody is denying all these things, why the heck are we still reading this kind of a thing with all these pictures? Now, if you look into this a little bit deeper, you would see we are now in an era where a lot of people are very skeptical readers. Now, let me give you some examples. For instance, right before 1800, I mean, wow, that's 200 years ago. Well, the only thing that we're talking about when we talk about getting information would be through oral or manuscript. So somebody has to tell you something, and that's how you get information, right? So those could be storytellers, could be town criers, could be elders. You believe anything from anything natural to anything divine. And that's why in those days we have stories like Frankenstein, werewolves, vampires, and all these stories actually started from those times. But then right after the 1800 to something like 1950s, the world has changed. Why? Because we have new technologies. For example, we have radios, we have television sets, and now people are getting their information not from elders, not from town criers, not from storytellers, but they're getting all these information from these electronic media. So what happened is you now have books, you have newspapers, you have magazines, you have televisions, you have radios. And then the world is getting more difficult. People are becoming more and more difficult in believing anything natural or divine. Now they've become something like anti-tradition. They want to be more efficient in understanding the world. They want to be more rational and individualistic. Now, mind you, if you look back in times, what happened is, now try to picture this. What we see in a week's newspaper, what we read from a week's newspaper, is all that the average person would read during the times of Shakespeare in his entire life. So we are being bombarded by information. Now, after 1950s, people are becoming even more skeptical because now it's not just the newspapers, the TV or radio that you're reading. You're also getting all sorts of information from the internet, from all sorts of multimedia sources. And the thing is, the reach of information has grown from something that is totally local. Remember, I said town criers, to national when we're talking about national televisions, and now we're talking about global. So people now become more skeptical. There are skeptics and they could be anti-hierarchy. So now all of a sudden, when we talk about information, we're talking about what interests me instead of what can I read. So before, when you're still in the times of Shakespeare, you would probably treasure so much that little bit of information because that's all you're going to read. Remember, a week's worth of the newspaper is what you already have for your entire life back in the 14th century. So today we are being bombarded by information that may not be necessary, or we are so selective in a way. Now, why am I telling you this? Now check this chart. Now, what you see on the screen right now is a chart that shows the amount of protests around the world from 1979 all the way to 2015. And if you look at that, you realize we're getting more and more and more and more protests all around the world. It's not just about democratic countries. It's not just about the West. It's not just about the East. We're talking about this all around the world. Why is this happening? Now, if you look at the society that we're living in right now, you may not be able to get the answers right away. But try to look at 3 ancient kingdoms. Okay, Mesopotamia, which is the present-day Iraq, Persia, which is the present-day Iran, and Afghanistan. Now, if you look at these countries, these ancient kingdoms, what happens is that you would realize that we are not skeptical enough. We are not the kind of skeptical readers who would read between lines and beyond words. We are not that skeptical. Why? All these 3 ancient kingdoms basically became prey or basically became victims of the modern information society. Now you might ask, why? Let me give you the first thing. Let me give you the first piece of information that you really need to know. Remember Saddam Hussein? Remember Iraq during the reign of Saddam Hussein? Now, among the 3 ancient kingdoms, Iraq is the first one that fell victim to the modern information society. Oh, wait a minute. I'm not saying that the information society is wrong, but the problem is we have too much fake news around. And if you still remember the Nyara testimony back in 1990s, you would remember how the fake testimony of a young girl could lead to war. Check this out.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying.
Babies taken from incubators by Iraqi soldiers thrown onto the floor? Are you serious? Wait a minute, where were you then? You provided that testimony, so you must be around. Are you hiding? And how did you manage to escape? Now, the thing was, this whole fake testimony actually led to the invasion of Iraq. Now, one thing, mind you, when the United States was invading into Iraq, they were saying that they were looking for weapons of massive destruction, WMDs. Yet, even after the death of Saddam Hussein in 2006, they found nothing. So why is it that they found nothing? Now, all this is because not just Iraq's been falling victim of the modern information society, but they've also been manipulated by a PR firm. Check this as well.
Nurse Naira became the mainstream's darling, but once the vote had safely passed, she admitted inventing the whole thing and was actually the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to Washington, lying to get the public to back war.
So what happened is, this ancient civilization, Mesopotamia, now is down. Do you want that? A fake piece of news that got transmitted through the most advanced information network. So what about the next one? The next one right next to it is, of course, Iran. Now look at how Iran's been blocked by all sorts of trade embargo, etc., etc. Wait a minute, why isn't the United States invaded Iran? Now, the answer is simple. Because they really have nuclear weapons, or they are really capable of making something like that. So when Saddam Hussein said, oh, well, I have nuclear weapons, yet in fact you don't have one, then that's a very good reason to invade. Because why? Because the US Army casualty is going to be kept at a minimal, simply because you really don't have that weapon of massive destruction. Had you had that, do you honestly think that the United States would actually invade Iraq? No. No, of course. So Iran knew it, so they made it. They realized that they need to have it. When people say you have it, you need to have it. Now, so Iran is now like stuck within the international society. And look, just right to the east of Iran, and that's Afghanistan. Now, what about Afghanistan? I'm not going to talk about Afghanistan anymore. Oh, well, you can check my Out of Afghan video, and you know everything about Afghanistan already. Come on, look at Afghanistan. The entire country has already been screwed up by the United States over the last 20 years. So, is there a way for them to do a stage back? I doubt. I honestly doubt. So, now you see from the ancient kingdoms, right? Iraq, Iran, and now Afghanistan. So, what's next? Now, looking at those 3 ancient kingdoms, one thing you have to understand is that what is really most devastating is not those weapons of massive destruction, but rather this new weapon of massive destruction, which is the control of media. The way you control media, the way you control public consent, the way you control public views, the way you control public knowledge against anything or on anything. Now, if you look at the Sinclair Broadcast Group in the United States of America, you would find that they are actually requiring all the news anchors to be reading out, reciting the same piece of information and spreading that as if it were their own words. Now, check this.
The sharing of biased and
False news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 This is extremely dangerous to our democracy. This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Now, that is extremely dangerous to our democracy. So, when you control the media, and by controlling what people can see, could see, then you control what should be done. So that gives them the proper reason, the right reason to just invade somebody else's country. Now, if you look at that, then you realize when you control a media, or when you see media as being controlled by giving out those false information and obviously biased information, you know something must be happening. Now, going back to that picture regarding the border dispute between India and China, remember what I said before? I said the Indian army shown there isn't marching because they've won that battle, and the Chinese soldier wasn't crying because he lost that battle. So what is it that they're trying to sell? What is it that they're trying to convey? Obviously, they're trying to convey hatred. Now, why would you need hatred between two big nations like that? Well, India's catching up. So why would you want the two most populous countries to be hating each other? What is the agenda hiding behind? The only thing that I can think of, somebody else must be benefiting from this. And who is going to be benefiting from that? Try to imagine this. Look at the scale of India. Look at the size of India. It's like an elephant. It's just like China. So when you have two elephants hating each other, fighting for each other, who's going to be benefited? We're talking about countries like United States. We're talking about the West. Because look, when they see the East as just markets, when they see the people in the East as just subjects, what happened is they're actually looking for benefits, monetary benefits. And if they want monetary benefits, of course, they don't want any one of these countries to really prosper. So in order to make them not prosper, the best thing is for you guys to fight. Why would I want to fight you guys? Remember the war between Iran and Iraq? Who viewed that? Americans. So, if there was going to be a fight between China and India, who would be most likely to view that? Americans, of course. Now, instead of telling you that you have something to be proud of, they're telling you who to hate. Now, wait a minute. You might ask me, what kind of a logic is this? Try to look at that from the American Civil War's point of view. Remember how they talk to each other? They don't consider, well, they would say, hey, North won and slavery's bad, but don't worry, you still have the Allman's brother and NASCAR. Now, wait a minute. They're telling you what to be proud of. Well, you have NASCAR, you have Allman's brothers. So, what are they trying to tell you is not about hatred, but rather things that you should be proud of. So, if I were to do that piece of news, instead of talking about the dispute between China and India, what we really should be saying is, okay, number one, let's sit down and talk. And by the way, there are things that both nations can be proud of. Wait a minute, look at India. You have King Ashoka, you have the Buddha, who lots of people are worshipping, lots of people are believing in. There are lots of great things that you have done in India that affects the whole world. So, why dwell on that hatred with China? The Chinese have a lot of things to be proud of as well. So when we are talking about border dispute, can we not sit down and talk about what you guys or what they are proud of? Well, that's a lot better than telling people, hey, look, we've won over you. Well, come on, is that little battle really matters that much? If you look at the scale of the battle, 200 people got kidnapped by Indian soldiers. Well, come on, is that even a victory? You call it victorious? Come on, what's the point of doing that? Sit down and talk about what each and every one can be proud of. That's the way of dealing international relations. You don't talk about the hatred that you have. The moment you see hatred in those kind of a newspaper or news reports, that means something is behind it. There is a force, of course, the dark side, right? So there is a force that is actually manipulating those kind of a news because they are spreading hatred, and that is not what we wanted. Now, if you look at that, you realize it's not just about that piece of news that we're talking about, but rather it's the actual mentality of who are those people writing those news reports. That should be condemned. That should be avoided. Why? Because it's not going to help. So what I'm really going to say here is that next time when you see a report like that, think twice, think thrice, think 4 times, and try to understand what's behind it, who's behind it, and who's going to be benefited out from that kind of a thing. So just chill. Don't be taken in by those pictures, by those hatred stuff. And until then, ciao.
Before you leave, please be sure to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share this with your friends. See you in the next episode.